May I now please request our second keynote speaker for the morning, Mr. Kartikeya Sarabhai, Founder and Director, Center for Environment Education, to please address all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief guest, members of the dais, and so many friends and people we worked with over the years. It's lovely to be here for this very intellectually, I think, stimulating 2 days, taking up the challenge which Mr. Berman just mentioned, that if you had a wish to do anything you liked in a school, what would you do to have the school for tomorrow? And it is in that thing that I'd like to start a bit with a little bit of history, that we are all aware that it was the UN in 1972 really recognized at the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm this whole issue of environment being a global level issue and which needs to be tackled at a completely different level. And it was India at that stage which really pointed out that removal of poverty and preserving the environment are really two sides of the same coin. And this whole issue of bringing sustainability and environmental education together really goes back to an initiative of that type. It was some years later, in 1977, in Tbilisi, Georgia, that this conference then led to the International Conference on Environmental Education. And it was really, even now, remains such a pioneering moment of what they've written. But some of those things, for instance, they did say that environmental education has to be and remains an integral part of education. It's ultimately good education. We call it environmental education, I think, but actually good education would mean that. They also mentioned how it needs to be lifelong and not confined to the formal education. And it is not adding one more subject. Environmental education is not adding one more subject, and it is going on. It was in 1984, when the Ministry of Environment was being formed, that some of us who were working in environmental education really argued that you need a focal point, you need a center of excellence which will work in partnership with others. It was not something envisaged as something separate, but working in partnership with others that is required in this country, that you cannot bring about the changes you are talking about through only passing legislation or bringing in new technologies or financial incentives. But unless people change, unless people's attitude change, this is not going to happen. And that was when CEE was also formed as a center of excellence of the Ministry of Environment and Forests at that time. We went in with NCRT to an activity approach. And this whole movement then came together in 1992 at the first Rio conference. Now, Rio is 20 years after Stockholm, and by this time the world had really come together to think about these problems. We were fortunate in having to write the India report, and one of the things we did say in that was that the challenge of development is not how to get there, but how not to. It is this whole concept, which Ajay just now mentioned, of requiring a different paradigm. Even in 1992, we were recognizing that the current paradigm of development, if we were all to follow that same path, is not sustainable. It was not sustainable. The world was still managing somehow because only a few had the ability to consume at that level, and the rest, due to poverty, were not. But the paradigm was still very much there. It was also at Rio that Agenda 21, Chapter 36, really brought about education, training, and public awareness as critical to this transformation. But values remained elusive. At that time, Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General, he very much wanted the Earth Charter to be part of the whole package of things which came out of Rio. But they also wanted the US to participate. And one of the conditions of the US was that we will not, in fact, discuss values and the Earth Charter. In fact, senior President Bush at that time mentioned that please note that the American lifestyle is not up for negotiations. Now it is lifestyles which is coming back now. We all recognize that unless lifestyles change, you are not going to be able to make this transformation. But something else happened the year afterwards in India, with MC Mehta filing a public interest litigation, saying that how do you expect us to follow the directives of our constitution of 51A, saying that Indian citizens should look after the environment if you don't teach it. And we became the first country in the world where environmental education became a compulsory part of every level of formal education. It was a remarkable change which happened in India and gave a fillip. Now, this was a time when we were all wondering how we would go about it. In fact, Dr. Barucha and we went through a maddening exercise of reading every textbook in India, in every language, to identify places where you could sort of insert a little environment message. Because that time there was the debate which was talking about should it be another subject or not, and we all argued that it's not a separate subject. It has to be part of science, it has to be part of social studies, in fact part of languages and everything else. And that is where this massive, I think, the volumes were higher, certainly taller than me, and that was the type of work which was done. By this time, the United Nations and through the leadership of Japan said that we need to look at education for sustainable development. Now, this is often shortened as ESD, but to me, there are 4 words there, and the one which is missing in that ESD is the word for, which is not emphasized. It's education for sustainable. It's not sustainable development education, which is about sustainable development. It is for. And for means it is a driver. It drives sustainable development. And driving force has to happen not only with schools. It starts very much, as Mr. Berman and Ajay have mentioned, with the youth. But ultimately decision makers have to come in and take those decisions. And that is where one of the first conferences of that decade was held in India at CE. And the Ahmedabad Declaration, which came about, that basically ESD must examine our own lifestyles. In fact, I remember on the last day, we had the final declaration up there, and it all seemed to be addressed to other people. And the youth group at that conference got up and saying, what sort of declaration is this, which talks about what others should do? And it was transformed into what we should do. That let us say that the UN and the countries will do what they like, and we will certainly work with them, but ultimately lifestyle changes have to come by each and every citizen, and certainly us who are at the conference. It was also a time when we all took inspiration from Gandhi. Gandhi's sentence that was part of that thing, education for life, education through life, and education throughout life. And it really brought about a lot of this thinking. And in fact, when you go to Indian thinking, you can go back to so much in the Upanishads and others, which really talk about, first of all, not being an anthropocentric world, being one with the planet, and being respectful and not being wasteful. And I think in a country which had these core values, we want to take them forward and put them in the new context. And it was in that light, when Pradeep ji mentioned about the World Environment School, that we really got very excited that we should all work together, and this conference was one of the outcomes. In 2005, we were doing a project in Andhra Pradesh. And in Hyderabad, in one of the schools, we were all talking about the global footprint, the way humans tread on the planet. And one of the schools, St. Mary's School, these little girls of 10 years, they came and said, why is we looking at environment in a negative way? And they put their hand and said, how about a handprint? Standing for what we can do. This little handprint here belongs to that girl, Shrija, of 10-year-olds from Hyderabad. And we launched it in the Tbilisi Plus 30 conference. And it is today, I would think, one of the few symbols which have started from a school in India, but which is globally used. It is remarkable how a powerful idea can go global. We are having 2 sessions this afternoon looking at different ways in which handprints are being used. But it is remarkable that is a contribution of India to global thinking on environmental education, that let's focus on what we can do and what we can do very positively. 2009 was another important landmark for us. The World Environment Day, UNEP had at that time got a campaign called CO2 Kick the Habit. And I was called to the ministry to say, let's propagate this. And I said, how do I ask a villager who doesn't have his first electricity connection to kick the habit? And he would well ask, should I first form a habit and then kick it? And that was something which showed us this whole concept of leapfrogging. And very cleverly, some of our colleagues changed the word K to P and made it pick right instead of kick the habit. That in India we have an advantage developing now after the environmental knowledge, and not 200 years ago when we didn't know what we were doing. Today we can do things right. We can do things right from the beginning. We do not have to keep on building flyovers after flyovers and then come to the conclusion that cars are not the solution to urban things. We can do it differently right from the beginning. And in some cases, we were doing it differently. A cloth bag was not something unusual in India, maybe just 2 generations ago. But today we have to actually run a campaign to tell people to use cloth bags. So I think that whole change of leapfrogging and the handprint really brought about. We also saw that there was such a possibility of sparking imagination. And the science train was one such instrument which we found. We did it first with the biodiversity COP in Hyderabad and then with the climate change. But it was something, and we used simple measures. For instance, we did a nationwide competition on name the national microbe. We said you have the national animal and you have national trees and everything else. But do you realize how much of the biodiversity of the world and how much is done through microbes and not through others? And it was something which just opened people's minds up. Simple campaign. There was voting and everything else. Lactobacillus, of course, of Dahi got the award. And the minister actually announced it. I think the official committee thought that this was not quite what national animals and birds are supposed to have. But I still hope that microbe gets its place. Now the problem with all of this, problems with what we are doing, is in the very examination system. And what we wrote then was that it's not only the paradigm of development which needs to change, but the paradigm of education also needs to change. You cannot, in the same straitjacketed education system, expect to just change content and do things differently. You had an example I give often. One of our friend's child was looking out of the window during the drought days, and when asked what do birds eat, said birds eat cows. And the teacher said, you please meet me after class. But in fact, you could see dead carcasses of cattle, and you could see vultures, in those days at least. You could see vultures and crows on the thing. But the correct answer was the textbook, which said grains and insects. So the whole disconnect between observation and what you write, between the fact that everyone has to be in classes of the same age group. There are limited times. There are some things which you can do and can't do. A lot of things have to change. The system itself needs to change. And I think that's where we are not yet there, because I don't think people have realized we are trying to fit in a completely new paradigm into a system which has got severe limitations. 2015 was important because the SDGs finally came. Also important because of the Paris Agreement. The Prime Minister very much wanted our tradition to be highlighted. And we brought out this book called Parampara, which was some of the Indian traditions which really took this forward. So how do we, again, mix Parampara or our traditions with modern thinking? Today, we have other challenges. We have challenges like in Gujarat, for instance, they've got a very efficient educational model which is still called command and control of schools. Now that command and control of schools basically ensures that all teachers are attending on time, all curriculums are there, but it's centralized the system to a great degree. We are talking about a system which also has the teacher as the center, and the teacher is empowered. Now, how do you bring both these together? How do you bring the fact that, on the one hand, you want everyone to get educated, and therefore you do need a certain supervision. At the same time, you don't want to lose creativity, and you want people to fix their syllabus with their surroundings. Now, how do you mix these two? So these are one of several challenges. We are currently engaged, again in partnership with UNEP and WWF, with the SDG, with the Tide Turner. It's a plastics thing, trying to get youth leadership coming in. We've got a very interesting program called the SDG Handprint Lab, which again gets students to work directly on that. And I think the handprint represents much of what we need to do, which is to get everyone not only to look at themselves, but to work with others. We look forward to really good discussions over these 2 days, and we're very excited about possible partnerships. That's the only way we will go forward. Thank you very much.